Hello students, I hope everybody's doing okay, and this is lecture for Unit 1 of History 1302. It is the 23rd of January of 2021, and of course we are about to reach the 1 year of COVID in the United States. I think by this time we'd already had one case or a couple of cases. I know that by this time it was already in China. So hopefully we'll get through this soon. One of the things I want to mention about this unit 1 of 1302, is this will probably be the hardest unit you ever attempt to successfully navigate. Of course, I do apologize. I'm rather, casual, and it's just been that kind of day. It's been raining outside and a lot of fog, and it's overcast and stuff like that. So it's kind of been a lazy kind of day. Um, what I want to tell you all is that the progressive era in the United States of America is a really hard period to deal with because there's a lot of things going on. The United States never really seemed to learn how to walk. It went from crawling to taking a couple of baby steps, and then the next thing you know, it's running. And between 1870 and 1929, with the crash of the stock market and other events that precipitated those issues, what we will have is that you have like this multi-pronged, uh, how do you say it, um, events that are going on. There is a social thread that is going on. There's, social with immigration. There is the United States is growing into its military fleet. The United States is going to go to war with Spain. In addition to that, the United States is going to close the West. The last push west is going to happen. And in addition to that, you're going to have the rise of two very distinct political parties, the Progressive Party and the Populist Party. The Progressive being an urban party, and the Populist being an agrarian, a farm, kind of venture. So it is a very big unit, and I stress that you hope that you all have been going along and doing your reading. Now, these video lectures, even though this material is taken from the lecture material in the unit, don't worry if the chapters in these lectures don't match. Worry about the units, the lectures that I give you for the reading that I post under the units in Blackboard, okay? Now, what we're going to look at first is the closing of the West. I'm gonna divide this into maybe four, maybe five lectures. Okay, some of the work you're going to have to do on your own, and also remember to look at John Green, because there's a lot of really good material there by John Green. So what we're going to see here is that um, we're going to attempt to close the West. And what we're going to do here is that the American West plays a very big part in the psyche of the American people. Okay. And there's something called American exceptionalism. And American exceptionalism is this part where did we get the idea that Americans are better than everybody else simply and because we're Americans? Where did this idea come out? This embracing of the Second Amendment, the embracing of, the cowboyish, like in Fort Worth. Where did these things come from? And it comes from the simple fact that half of, from the Mississippi on west, was settled by a lot of people. But then again, I know that the statistics vary, but some people say that 2 in 10. Some people say that 1 in 10 people that actually went west failed. I've heard 2 in 10. I've heard 1 in 10. I've heard 1 in 5. The bottom line is that the vast majority of the people that attempted to settle and go west did not make it because it's incredibly hard. I mean, just imagine living in Fort Worth without air condition, or trying to settle Kansas, with this idea that we don't have predictable rain. They are going to play up some deals. They're going to say, like, all you need to do is go and plow the soil, and there's trapped water in the soil. And when you do that, the trapped water in the soil is going to go up, and then it's going to rain. It's going to say the rain follows the plow. We all know that that is not true. The other thing that's going to happen is that we're going to have a man by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner that is going to point out and say, you know, the West is significant because it makes us who we are. At the end of the day, we Americans, or Americans, the United States, is still a very Turnerian society. Now, that may be my own verb, Turnerian, or it may not be. But the West is still very appealing. I mean, if you look at here, a lot of people are moving west towards Aledo. They're moving to spaces that are not as populated. Then they think that the school district is better, the air is cleaner, the grass is greener, the water is better. So this whole idea of starting new institutions, you go west where there are, for the most part, not as many people living there. Okay. Now, when Turner writes about this, he says once the frontier is closed, once all these areas are settled, once all these places are territories and states, then Americans are going to have to find something else to do. Because if they don't, they're going to implode. And that is true. We as Americans need to find something else. We need to, have something to do. That's why Friday, it's like Friday, it's the end of the weekend, it's the end of the week. We go into the weekends, there's football games, barbecue. Those are things that we look forward to. If we don't have those things to look forward to, if we don't have those goals to try and break, if we don't have those personal things that we need to do, then we as Americans will cease to be free Americans. Turner did not see the West as a particular geographic place. It's a series of places where savagery, in quotations, meets civilization. So we, the civilized people, determine what savages are, because we, like the Romans, are the civilized people, and of course, those people that live that are not like us, they are savages. The other thing is that the history of the United States is really a bunch of stories woven together about people being successful and unsuccessful, going from places that are not settled to places that are settled. And by doing these things, then Americans will reproduce themselves individually, and that's how democracy spreads, right? You work hard, the plow. This lady was out here and her husband, and they started this small little farm, and they ended up having this huge cattle ranch. But they don't tell you about all the horrible things about her son that got struck by lightning, and her other son that got killed by the Indians, and the day that her husband got kicked in the head by a horse and he was comatose for 6 months, and then he finally died of starvation. and then she ended up marrying the guy next door who had lost his wife to a tuberculosis epidemic, and they made a family together, and they had some children together, and eventually he died, but for the most part, the children that they had were successful, and one became a senator in Wyoming or Texas, and they had a huge horse ranch. Yeah, that's a very romantic tale, but she doesn't tell you about all the hardships that they went through. They only give you the finished product, okay? Now, in order for Americans, we Americans, US Americans, to remain free, we have to reproduce these things. We have to, in a sense, have success stories. And a couple of us need to go ahead and trickle up into the ranks of success and become those millionaires or those famous football stars, or the next I don't know, the lady that just sang, Lady Gaga, the next Lady Gaga, or the next man to become president who was the son of a single mother, like Barack Obama. The couple of us need to make it to the top in order for the rest to have that idea that we can do it, right? And that's an American success story. And as long as there is an American success story, then that's going to allow us to believe in what we have. Like I believe that I'm a success story. I mean, I'm a ninth grade dropout and I'm teaching at a college, and I make a good living. I've got really good insurance. I've got really good bosses, and I work for a really good institution. And I'm not saying that just because I want to say it. It's the truth, and I want my children to do the same. But unless we have these things, then Americans will implode. We as US Americans will not be able to maintain our democratic traditions without the access of free land, as in free land to purchase, and free success to be able to take advantage of. If we don't have the notion that some of us can do it, then nobody's going to be able to do it. Even in the presidency of Donald Trump, where a businessman who had zero political experience was able to become the president, where else could that happen? Well, in the United States. So, where else could an entrepreneur businessman become the president? The United States. Where else could, the son of a single mother become president? The United States. So that in itself is American exceptionalism. Okay. The other thing that we have is we have space. Like, a lot of people complain that too many people are coming to Texas. Well, the only asset that Texas has is land. Okay. And we have lots of it. Places like Wyoming, places like South Dakota. I'm not going to say that places like California, but places like Arizona, places like New Mexico, places like not so much Colorado, but Kansas, the Dakotas, I'll repeat them again, Montana, Washington, Idaho, Oregon. All those places have a lot of land. There's a lot of open space. And with that comes the idea of a mystical Garden of Eden. Things are better there because population is less. It's not like, New York City. I think in New York City proper, I think it's 8 million people live in the island of New York, New York. I don't know if it's 8 million or 20 million. Somebody can fact check me. But 8 million or 20 million is too much. Okay? If you've been to New York City, it's a small island. Okay? Whether it be 8 million people or 20 million people, can you imagine 8 million? That's what lives in DFW. And DFW is considered to be from Denton to, I think, Cleburne, and from, I think, Mesquite, or a little further than Mesquite, to Weatherford. There's about 8 million people living there. Well, imagine that many people living in New York. Okay. Okay. I paused it and I checked it, and it's 8,419,000 people live in the city of New York. Okay, so that's a lot of people, and they live up. You know what I mean? So anyway, uh, now, uh, out of these experiences of going west, we're going to have characters. We're going to have individuals like Wild Bill Cody and Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp. And then, of course, we're going to have people like psychopaths like Billy the Kid, that the West is going to create this, aside from it being a mythical Garden of Eden, it's going to be this ramshackle in place where rugged individualism and self-reliance, is what prevails, and you have a yeoman farmer and a always fighting with a wealthy cattle baron and the lawless gunslinger and the hardy cowboy. Nobody depends on each other, and that's not true. If you wanted to be successful in the West, you needed to depend on each other. I mean, maybe the big cattle ranchers didn't, and we all know that most of these outlaws and gunslingers met an untimely and brutal death, many of them dying before they were even 30 years of age, okay? I mean, if you made it past the Indians and you made it from past getting, struck by lightning, believe it or not, a lot of people got struck by lightning in the West. Or you made it past being stampeded, or you didn't die in a cholera epidemic or a, tuberculosis epidemic or whatever it may be. You didn't die of botulism because you ate some bad beef or something and you made it, then those things, that in itself is going to make you a survivor. I mean, if you were 35 years of age and you were alive in the West, that you were already doing pretty good. If you were getting into your 40s and 50s and 60s, you were doing really good. Now, what begins to happen is that the first big business that's going to emerge, and we're going to talk about it later on, is the railroad. And I used to have a professor. He's still alive. His name is Ricardo Francaviglia, and he was enamored with the railroad. I mean, this guy was just. I mean, he was infatuated with the railroad. I could never get it. And after I finished graduate school, I started reading about the railroads, and I realized that, oh my God, this guy hit the nail on the head. The railroad is the equivalent of not only air travel, but the railroad was the equivalent of the internet. I mean, you could be in Ireland, you know, your whole family died in the potato famine. You scrounge up the equivalent of a small fortune of $14. You use $7 to pay for passage to come across the ocean in a steamship. And in 7 days, you are in New York. You happen to be healthy. You're 19 years old. You don't have to be quarantined because you don't have any disease or anything. And you make it through Ellis Island. You decide that you don't want to live in New York City, but you hear that you can go west. So with the little money that you have, you have $7 left, you make your way to Ohio, through maybe a canal system. I don't know, just you make it to Ohio, and in Ohio, from there you go to St. Louis, and in St. Louis you take a train. The train has just been built in 1877. The railroad has met west. You got $4 left, and you say, I'll go as far as these $4 take me. And you end up somewhere in, I don't know, you pick Colorado, Kansas, you know, somewhere along there. Or maybe you have enough money to make it to San Francisco. So in a span of a month, you've gone from Ireland to San Francisco or Sacramento. Wow, that's incredible. 19-year-old kid from Ireland is now in Sacramento, Maybe he's got $4. Maybe maybe he's got $2 left, and he did some work, and he buys himself some prospecting equipment, and he goes and he looks for gold in the California hills. Okay, so do you see how important the railroad is going to be? We'll talk about the railroad again in a little bit, because the railroad is the first American corporation. Okay, it is, and we're going to talk about corporations also. All of these threads in this unit are going to be all separate, and then at the very end of the unit, they're all going to come together, and they're going to make perfect sense. But you're going to have to pay attention, because if you don't, it's not going to make any sense, and you're going to fail the exam miserably. Okay, and I'm not saying that to be mean. Okay, I'm just saying it because it's true. We're going to talk about the Cowboys now. We all like to think that Cowboys are like the Marlboro Man. Excuse me, the Marlboro Man. Had a hiccup there. And the Marlboro Man never pays attention to anybody. He's not anybody's friend. He never talks to anybody. He's really in love with this, lady that works in a saloon. She doesn't really want to be working in a saloon. She has to work in a saloon because her mother died of tuberculosis, and she just wants to earn enough money to go to Sacramento too, because life is better there. But the bottom line is that the cowboy left because he didn't want to be a farmer, like a dirt farmer like his dad. And the young lady working at the saloon, well, the only thing that she can afford to do is, to work a saloon as a woman of ill repute. And the bottom line is that she's not doing very well. She probably has an STD or two, and maybe she does have tuberculosis, but she's still just trying to make it by. But they're all in search of a dream. About 35,000 people worked as cowboys, okay? Most of these people were individuals that had worked in the railroad. I mean, sorry, in the railroad, that had been in the Civil War. And during the Civil War, people get a taste of beef because of Richard Mifflin and Richard King, the King Ranch. They take beef from Texas to Galveston, and from Galveston to the meat packing companies in New York. I hate to break it to you, Texans. The best steakhouses in the United States, and for the most part in the world, are found in New York City. And whether you believe it or not in Texas. There may be some damn good ones in Texas, and I'm not saying that they're not. But you haven't had a steak until you've gone to Delmonico's. And, that's where the steak really takes the front. So after the Civil War, there was about 5 million cattle that were just there for the taking. And about 35,000 young men decided to go do it. Between 1864 and 1884, those 35,000 men move about 5 million head of cattle from more or less Brownsville up the I-35 corridor through Laredo, Texas. It circumvented Laredo, and then came up to maybe the side of San Antonio, side of Austin, and then right up through Waco. They did go through Waco, and they came up through Fort Worth. When they came up through Fort Worth, they come up the I-35 corridor. When they got to Berry Street, they took a left and they went up 8th Avenue. And they went up 8th Avenue all the way until you have where the downtown campus, TCC campus is, and they crossed right there at the low water crossing, and then they would go to the Swift Premium place, either to be packed there, or they would keep them there and then move them up to Kansas. The further north they would take them, the more money they would make. But for the most part, they would take them there, they would sell them there to somebody else, and then somebody else would move them further up north, all the way to Kansas City. Okay. Now, the people that were cowboys, you always think of it's like the Marlboro Man, a sandy blonde or brown haired guy with blue eyes, red, rough skin, but it was really 12%, about 25% of the cowboys were black, about 12% were Mexican, and about 63% were white. Now, I don't know who came out with these exact numbers. I found these in a book one day, and that's what I put. But the reason that African Americans were such a successful cowboys, and they were the best of all of them, okay? The best cowboys were African American, was because most of them were runaway slaves. And because they were runaway slaves, they had learned to survive in the arid conditions of Texas and the frontier. And remember, Texas was once a part of Mexico, and slavery was illegal in Mexico, so they kind of hung around here. When that went away, when Texas became part of the United States, they kind of went into northern Mexico and into New Mexico and Arizona, and then once the Civil War was over and they were emancipated, they all came back. Now, the Mexicans are the ones that contribute the most to cowboying. Okay, they contribute, the lasso, we call it riata, spurs, a lot of the roping saddles, and so on and so forth. However, it is the Anglo-American cowboys that modify it and make use the skills of African Americans, the skills of the Mexicans, and the tools of both, and they turn it into one thing. Okay, now what happens here is that this is going to be a really hard job. I mean, you're moving cattle all the time. Just imagine going all the way to Laredo and rounding up cattle south of Laredo. Watch the movie Lonesome Dove, and you're moving cattle up the trail. You're crossing rivers, again, lightning, Indians, stampedes, you name it. The famous cattle drives that come through here are the Goodnight Loving that begins near Weatherford. What he would do is that he would buy the cattle in that were coming up. He would buy cattle from people bringing it up. He would keep them there in his ranch, and then he would take them as far north as he could. He actually, Charles Goodnight, if I'm not mistaken, was it? I don't remember. It was Goodnight or Loving that dies. I forget. Okay, hold on. I always get him confused. Charles Goodnight dies in Arizona of old age, or in 1929, and Oliver Loving gets an arrow shot in his leg, and he dies of gangrene. Um, and he's buried in Parker County. That's so. If you want to watch something that really mirrors that, watch Lonesome Dove, Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove. You'll really enjoy it. Uh, Oliver Loving dies in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, of gangrene, and then his final resting place is in Weatherford, Texas. Okay, and Bo Zikard is also buried in Weatherford. In my opinion, the best cowboy that has ever lived, Bo Zikard, and he is portrayed by he is portrayed in Lonesome Dove. His name is Dietz in that movie. Now, Dietz is played by Danny Glover. Okay, I'm sorry I'm all over the place. I didn't mean to go into this. If we were doing face to face, we would be watching this movie and you'd be working on it on your own. So we cannot give all the credit just to Anglo Americans. Okay, we have to give credit to African Americans. We have to give credit to Mexican Americans, and we of course are going to give credit to Anglo Americans. But what ends up happening is that the cattle that they're bringing up are Longhorn cattle. They're not cattle they're not meat cattle. They're meat cattle, but they're not like real meat cattle. They're not Chatelet or Hereford or Angus or anything like that. And what ends up happening is that they start importing breeds from Europe, um, from Scotland, and they start importing them to places like the King Ranch, and they start developing cows that are square, full of meat instead of these stringy, longhorns that usually do not yield that much meat. Nowadays they call them corriente, and the name corriente translates into just common, like mutt mixed cattle. And I slaughtered one last year, and they're good cows, but they just don't give you the fullness of you know you'll get a lot more meat out of a 3-year-old Angus steer than you will a 3-year-old uh, Longhorn steer. Trust me on that one. Okay. So the fact of life in the West was not independence. It was self-reliance. I mean, these cowboys had to be cool with each other. And most African Americans say that the least amount of racism that they ever encountered was on the cattle drive. If you were a white cowboy, you could not be a bigot and be ugly to the Mexicans and the black cowboys, because if you were all of a sudden pinned under a horse, they're just going to leave you there. Maybe the African American cowboy had the sewing kit, you know. Maybe you had a thorn stuck in your thumb and like, like in Lonesome Dove, and you need somebody to take it out. Maybe you've got some kind of digestive issue and you need the cook to hook you up with something, and the cook was Mexican. So if you were ugly to him, he wasn't gonna hook you up with some kind of herbal remedy for your stomach ailment, or help you put a splint on your leg because you fell off a horse and you broke it. So the West was not independent. All these cowboys were very interdependent with each other. They bought themselves their Colt 45 for $14. I keep coming back to $14, but a Colt 45 at this time was $14. Um, and then a box of ammunition uh, was, if I'm not mistaken, $3, which was still a small fortune back then, but you didn't have to buy a whole box. You just bought enough shells to have some, and that was it. Now, what do we do about the native population, or what are we going to do about the farmers that are there? You're coming up through Texas and you've got a guy that's got a farm and he's got barbed wire. Barbed wire is eventually going to kill the cattle drive. Barbed wire is going to kill it. The railroads are going to kill it, and better cattle are going to kill it. Why should we be raising longhorns when we can raise, Angus cows that are not as temperamental, that are not going to hook me with their horns? Like the Angus cows that we used to have, my wife and I used to raise, were polled, Polled, and that means they didn't have any horns. So you don't have to worry about them accidentally hooking you or on purposely hooking you. And we raised them in a very small spread. They're very docile. They're meant to gain a lot of weight. And when they were done, they would take them to the auction, sell them, put them on a train, and then sell them. There's no need for a cowboy anymore. There's a need for a ranch hand, but not a cowboy. Okay? So barbed wire is going to kill that, right? We're also going to have the smooth chilled plow. That means that these people are going to start plowing this land and start producing the food to feed the cows instead of allowing the cows to graze. This means that you're going to put weight on these cows a lot faster, okay? And then, of course, you have the railroad. If you have 50 head of cattle and you sell them, then all you need to do is put 50 head of cattle in a railroad car and move them up to Fort Worth, or move them up as far north as you want to move them. The further north you go, the more money you get. Sell them to a feedlot, and then you come right back and start all over again. So when what's going to happen is that these cowboys are going to come to this land, and they're going to see that in this land there is a pond that this farmer made, and their cows need the water. They're going to cut the wires. So then you're going to have a fence war. Why are you cutting my fence? You don't have the right to do that. Your cows, walked all over my wheat. They ate it, and then they trampled it, and then they drank some of the water from my pond that I use for my livestock. So then you're going to have gunfire, and you're going to have the barbed wire wars. And these were serious wars, people. It was murder, at its finest. Not that murder is fine, but I mean, it was all out bloodshed. There's some rumors, I have to ask my old professor, David Clinkscale, that the rumor is that if, fence cutting is still a serious crime in Texas. I mean, imagine you cut somebody's fence, a cow gets out. Here comes this family that decided to take a drive out in the country. They're driving along, and here's this freaking bull standing in the middle of the road. They T-bone the bull. Two of the family members are dead. The guy's got a dead bull. Who are they going to blame? They're going to tell the farmer, hey, man, you owe me damages. Half of my family's dead because of your bull. It's like, well, wait a minute. No, somebody cut my fence. It wasn't that I had a bad fence. It's somebody cut my fence. So fence cutting is a serious crime, and don't do it. If you know. Also, the other thing, it's just don't do it. The other thing is, what about Native Americans? We've been talking about settling and celebrating and doing all these wonderful things, and what are we going to do with Native Americans? I mean, we've been moving them west. We the last time we moved them through the Trail of Tears under Jackson, we moved them to Oklahoma, and we told them we're never going to move you again. And then we moved them from the Black Hills of Dakota because there's gold in there. So now we want to move them from Oklahoma because there's a bunch of sodbusters that want land. And President Rutherford B. Hayes is going to say, yeah, let's go ahead and give them that land. So that's going to create. I want to make sure that I said it was Harrison that gave away the last chunk of land in Oklahoma in 1893. I don't know if I said William Henry Harrison. He was president in 1841, so I may have messed up. But the president that signed the Homestead Act was Lincoln. And from the end of the Civil War until 1893, so basically 1865, I think, to 1893, you have the parceling out and the giving out of land at relatively cheap rates for individuals to go west, okay? But the last one is done with uh, Harrison, Benjamin Harrison. I think president before him was Grover Cleveland. But 1893, Harrison gives it. That's why they call Oklahoma the Sooners. And friends of mine like Professor John Lundberg says, they're land thieves. A lot of them left early, and they would leave early because they would get 4 stakes, and they would stake their claim, and they would steal the land. So now you're telling the Indians that they have to move again, and it doesn't make any sense to me that you're telling these Native Americans to move and move and move. And then eventually they move them to reservations, but they don't tell them that they can't sell that land. And they end up selling, I think the equivalent of, I think it's like uh, 86 million acres of reservation land that they was given to them. They end up selling like 2/3 of their reservation land. Now, what happens with a lot of Native Americans that they were not used to living on reservations. Also in 1867, you have a peace commission that's supposed to civilize and pacify the Indians. Indians are nomadic people. They're not sedentary people. They also send them to places like the Carlisle School to try and educate them. And in addition to that, uh, there's the government's a desire to calm these Indians down and to enforce policy on them is a key element in them not being successful. Okay, um, a lot of pressure is put on them to sell their reservation lands, especially when they find gold there, and their land begins to shrink. And then, of course, the United States government decides, well, when we build a railroad, why don't we just kill the buffalo? We've got this. We can tell people that we can give them the ammunition if they rent the rifle. And I said that correctly. They would rent the rifle and they would give you ammunition to indiscriminately shoot in the herds of bison. Um, a lot of men were making a living shooting bison to feed the railroad workers. And of course, since they didn't have refrigeration, they would shoot as many needed to be shot. And in 1865, you have about 12 to 15 million buffalo living on the American plains. And then by 1885, there's a couple of hundred. Ironically, some of these are living in Oliver Loving's ranch. I mean, so you have very, very little bison left. And once they kill the bison, the mobile grocery cart of the Native Americans, they kind of just give up. Not to mention that you're going to have in 1864, you're going to have the Shivington Massacre. You're going to have Red River Way. It's a defeat of the Comanche in 1874. In 1877, they're going to catch Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce trying to flee into Canada, and they give up. And then, of course, you have the Indians fight back uh, uh, at Little Bighorn, and the retaliation of Little Bighorn is Wounded Knee. So the Indians come and kill Custer, and then at Wounded Knee, the Sioux are camped there for the winter, and they massacre them. You know, men, women, and children. In 1886, Geronimo is put in a reservation, and between 1866 and 1890, the government battles the Sioux, and the Sioux just finally just give up. They finally realize that there is no way out of this, that there's no way that they're going to be able to make it, so they give up. And in 1887, they passed the Dawes Severalty Act. And I call this the final nail on the Indian coffin. And this was done to transform Indians into farmers. And this is where you're going to have, you know, a lot of this reservation land. 86 million acres, or 2/3 of the land that is given to them, that's just going to be sold. The Indians don't have that capitalist notion of that private land ownership, okay? What ends up happening is that what land is kept by Indians is not good for agricultural development, and the Indians are destroyed. They, fall into a vicious cycle of alcoholism, suicide, a very low birth rate. They're very susceptible to diseases. In addition to that, they will not assimilate, even though we try to force them to assimilate. And we're not going to see comprehensive or good Indian legislation until 1832, 34, and 36 under FDR, and under the Secretary of the Interior, I think was Collier, if I'm not mistaken. Now, I mean, even today, I just had a friend of mine tell me that who was working recently in New Mexico with the Navajo, and he says that it's atrocious the way that they live in abject poverty, that COVID has hit them really hard, that alcoholism is to the point that to where a lot of them are drinking some of the sanitizing agents that are given to them because of alcoholism. And it's also my knowledge that they have a methamphetamine problem on Indian reservations. So we still owe them a lot. We still owe them a lot. You know, places like Pine Ridge Reservation in the Dakotas, and of course also the Navajo reservations. You go take pictures of these places and you think it's another country, but unfortunately it's not, you know. The other thing that we don't mention is that we don't talk about women. And I talked about women earlier. You know, the women are always there, childbearing, taking care of children. You know, the husband gets kicked in the head by a mule and they try to nurse the husband back. You know, the bottom line is that, when the government under Abraham Lincoln says you can have 160 acres for a $10 registration fee, a lot of people say, yeah, I'll do it. And you can have an extra 1,600 acres if you plant trees on the land. If it's land like, Kansas or Wyoming, that there isn't any trees. So you're going to have, things like the Timber Culture Act. I want you to know that one. An amendment to the Homestead Act. It gives an extra 1,600 acres if you promise to plant trees in it, and a quarter of it, they would give you the trees. The Desert Land Act. This was for land in Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada. In California, that you could have 640 acres at $1.25 an acre, but you had to provide irrigation. Then you have my favorite one, the Timber and Stone Act of 1878 allowed anybody in Nevada, California, Oregon, and Washington to buy land that was, quote, unfit for civilization for $2.50 an acre. Now, here's the deal. This land that was $2.50 an acre is land that now is considered the most pristine in the world. There's a rumor that Bill Gates has a house in some of these places where things have to be helicoptered in. Like when they were building the home there, all of the materials for his mansion was actually flown in. They had to make like a runway and bring all this stuff in, and everything has to be brought in via air. That's truly amazing that there are places like that. This land is not for sale. However, there is still land that is for sale. Every year, the Department of the Interior sells a certain amount of acreage to the people of the United States, and it's real easy to do. You just bid for it, and you have to say like, well, for this chunk of land, I promise to pay $14 million for it. And then if you win it, they tell you won, and if you didn't, they just send you $14 million back. You have to have a letter of credit from a bank saying that you're good for the money. So you and I will never, I mean, maybe you will, but I'll never buy government land because I don't have that kind of money. It's a silent auction where you make a sealed bid, and they just basically open the bids until they hit the highest one, and that's the one that wins. It's not really fair, is it? Technological advancements that help clothe the West. We talked about it. Barbed wire, the smooth chill plow. With the invention of the Bessemer process, we now have steel. Hey, we don't have iron. Iron is brittle, it can break. That's going to add to the land bonanza. Okay, agricultural planting techniques in low rainfall areas and other different strands of wheats and grains that are more apt to grow on the North American plains. Okay, a lot of these agricultural techniques were brought in by the Spaniards, who had been taught those by the Moors in North Africa when they invaded Spain. So you have something here that started in North Africa, low irrigation farming. It went to Spain. From Spain, it made its way to Mexico. From Mexico to South Texas. From South Texas to Kansas. From Kansas, you have the Midwest. Okay. Of course, modified wheat, wheat that would grow in the wintertime, and some wheat that would grow into the mild summers of the Midwest. And I will say mild because they're mild in comparison to Texas. Well, maybe not now, but then they were. And large scaled operations that had now horse drawn and steam driven equipment. Okay. You have plows, you have tractors, you have all this cool new equipment. That was all, of course, incredibly dangerous, that people would die using, and all that, neat kind of stuff. I don't mean to sound, all dark and stuff, but that's what happened. You also have individuals coming in from Mexico. You have individuals coming in from Peru. You have Germans. You have Chileans. A lot of these individuals coming from these countries were immigrants, like the Chinese that moved to Peru and moved to Chile, would then move to California and bring their agricultural mining and, of course, their agricultural techniques, mining techniques, and all that. And of course, you've got gold in the Dakotas. You've got a remnant of gold going on in California. That was in in 49, but still, there's still something going on there. And of course, later on in northern Mexico and in Arizona, you're going to have copper mining, and that's going to take off like crazy. In Texas, you're going to have coal, and so there's a lot going on. There's a lot of resources that need to be tapped into. But the main problem that we have in the Southwest, which is Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, is the lack of water. Until they build Hoover Dam in the 1930s, you're gonna be dependent on rain. And if you're dependent on rain, well, it's like you're dependent on miracles. But once they build Hoover Dam, and they dam up the Colorado River, and all that rainfall that comes from uh, uh, the Colorado mountains, you're gonna have Lake Mead, which is the biggest reservoir in the United States, if I'm not mistaken. So remember, Hoover Dam, Lake Mead, Lake Mojave, damming of the Colorado River. Actually, it's below level right now, and they don't think it's ever going to come up again. I mean, it is a lifeline to the Napa Valley and for agriculture there. And of course, all of the land in that area is incredibly fertile. Okay, it's incredibly fertile there because when the great uh, uh, during the Ice Age, glaciation period, the glaciers came through there and ground up a bunch of that rock and pushed it all up into the sides and created this very rich loess, this soil that was very rich. It's got a lot of nutrients in it, so now you have water from, of course, the snow, and you've got an agricultural mecca there. Now, if you come up east of course, Arizona and Colorado, then it's not that much fun. Okay, because why? Because there's not a lot of water. You got 160 acres, but you're making a house out of sod. Okay, you're cutting it out of dirt, or you're making bricks with straw and mud. Um, Kind of like Little House on the Prairie. Okay, it's hot in the summer, cold in the winter, and you pretty much like lived in a burrow. Okay, now they do bring advanced farming techniques. They do come up with them, and with the demise of the Indian and the introduction of the barbed wire, you're going to see the uh, herding of sheep, of raising sheep. And the cool thing about sheep is that it's a two industry animal. Okay, it gives you wool, and then it gives you mutton. Okay, and of course, a lot of sheep fat is used for lubrication in the factories out in the east. It's also used for it's used for soap. It is used for candles, you name it. And of course, sheep are very adaptable. They are not bottom feeders like cattle. Cattle, for the most part, will eat what's on the ground and maybe a little bit as far as they can. But if you have sheep, they will eat as far as they can perch themselves on. So if you got trees, they browse like deer. And then goats will even climb up the trees and eat as far as they can. So, and their diet is a lot more diversified than cows. They're ruminants just like cows, where they eat a lot of forage, and then they sit down and they regurgitate it and they chew their cud. That takes a lot of energy to do, so they have to eat a lot of grass in order to grind it down and pass it through their two stomachs, and then eventually turn it into something that they can digest. Okay, and then of course their pellets or their excrement is very fertile. So you have, as long as you keep rotating them, then sheep farming is going to be really good. Sheep raising is going to be really good. And then after the winter, when the spring comes in, then you clip them and you sell your wool. So you got money coming in all the time. You get all your boys and you band them, and then you sell your boys as mutton. You keep your females and a couple of boys to breed them, and you've got an industry. So sodbusters do really well. In South Texas and in the Southwest, it was not uncommon to see people raising sheep and goats and chickens and pigs more than they would raise cattle. Okay, especially pigs. The problem with pigs is that you need water all the time. They need water more than anything else. They don't sweat, so they constantly have to keep them wet. But every time a sow has pigs, you get anywhere between 8 and 20 piglets. You know what I mean? And they breed twice a year. Where sheep do the same thing. They gestate 5 months, so you get 2 litters every year. It's with a cow, you get one every 18 months. So you got a bigger turnover here. You got cows, you got pigs, you got goats, and you got sheep. You got a multi-industry thing going there. So smaller, more diverse farms were always more successful than bigger farms that only focused on one thing. Okay? But they were still sod busters. I mean, if it quit raining, that's it. You know, if you ever want to see what it's like, read Elmer Kelton's The Time It Never Rained. And the time it rains, and he loses a bunch of his sheep because they push each other into the bonfire that he builds, because it starts raining during a freezing storm, and he thinks they're going to die. So they build a giant bonfire, and the sheep in the back are trying to get close to the fire to get warm. So they push the sheep in the front into the fire. That's why they don't give sheep a lot of credit, because if you're going to be like sheep, you're just going to follow each other. And the sheep do tend to do that. That's why you don't do that. You have a good dog, like a Grand Pyrenees, that doesn't let them do that. Okay. Um, what were African Americans doing Reconstruction? Well, they were buying land. They were moving out. They were working, uh, uh, out in the country. And then later on, when we talk about civil rights, we're going to talk about the Hayes-Tilden election, Plessy v. Ferguson, Booker T. Washington, but I'm going to leave that for civil rights. So we're going to do nothing with civil rights uh, for at this time. We're just going to uh, leave it with that. Okay. Let's go ahead and talk about the railroad, and then we'll wrap it up, because that's all I have left. I have the railroad, and that's pretty much it, and that wraps up this hour-long lecture. Now, grants for the railroad began under the Lincoln administration. They said, during the Civil War, we realized that one of the ways that the North was able to overwhelm the South and win was that there was so much more railroad built in the North than there was in the South. And that means that you can move troops, you can move food, and you could move munitions a lot faster than you could on a wagon. Okay. So there wasn't actually one transcontinental railroad. There was actually four transcontinental railroads, and they were not all built at the same time. I'm sorry. They were all actually being built at the same time. We just focus on the Union Pacific Central Railroad that was built between 1869, and it's finished I believe in 1876. I get these dates all mixed up. I'm telling you, the progressive era is a doozy. Okay, it's not the easiest thing in the world to listen to wrap your head around. Uh, and that one starts from Nebraska to San Francisco. That one goes from San Francisco to Nebraska. Okay, so Leland Stanford is going to start in San Francisco, and what we're going to have coming from the east. Um, I believe it was Doc Durant, and he was a doctor, he became a businessman, he created Credit Mobilier, and that's how it was built from Nebraska on, you know, to meet at Promontory Point in Utah. Leland Stanford actually, because he was wealthy, financed it on his own with some contributors to that. You also have the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. That one went from Kansas to Los Angeles by way of Santa Fe and Albuquerque. You had the Southern Pacific that went from San Francisco to New Orleans, but it also went San Francisco, Yuma, El Paso, and then New Orleans. So you've got the Southern, right? Then you've got the Northern Pacific that goes from Duluth, Minnesota to Portland, Oregon. So you got North, you got South, you got, I mentioned the Atchison, Topeka, that's Kansas, Los Angeles, but it would go Kansas, Santa Fe, and then down to Los Angeles. And then, of course, you would have many others like the Texas and Pacific, the Great Northern, Chicago, Rock Island. The primary railroads were built by the Chinese. They were coming from the west to the east. Chinese from the east to the west. They were built by Civil War veterans, mostly Civil War veterans, but for the most part, Leland Stanford figured out that, who built the Great Wall of China? Well, the Chinese did. And he says, well, let's get our labor from China. It would cost them an average of bringing an individual from China $7. They would get what they would call gangs. Uh, they would go to certain places in China and round up these people and basically put them in a debt peonage, okay? Because they had to buy from the railroad stores, they had to work for the railroad stores, they made $7 a month, and it would cost them $7 to get here. So it was absolutely brutal work. Nobody really knows how many died. Some people say like 1,500. I think that number is way too small. I think it may be anywhere between, maybe 3 to 5,000. And they themselves created industries within there. They would create their own little towns as they would. There is a mini series about the railroad. I forget what it's called. I'll remember it, but it's on Netflix and it's really good. Okay, but it shows actually uh, the Credit Mobilier scandal, and of course Doc Durant is there, and it shows how Leland Stanford prevails over Doc Durant. Durant basically is penniless because, I mean, he's always robbing Peter to pay Paul, and of course Leland Stanford was not like that. Of course, Leland Stanford, the benefactor to Stanford University. Uh, Now you're by 1883, 1890, you've got a good network of railroads, and then eventually you're gonna have the Tex-Mex Railroad that's going to join uh, Mexico and Texas, and then of course you're gonna have the Tex-Mex Railroad that's gonna go from South Texas up the I-35 corridor and then meet in Fort Worth. And then that one would meet with the Southern Pacific, right? Because that one goes from San Francisco to New Orleans by way of Yuma, Arizona, and El Paso. So that means it's got to come right through Fort Worth, and then it would cut down to New Orleans, okay? Sometimes, again, eventually it would go down to I follow I-10 in San Antonio, but if I'm not mistaken, the first one comes up to Fort Worth and then back down. I may be wrong. I'll double check. Those are things that I'm not going to ask you in the exam. I may ask you other more general things about the railroad. Now, one of the things that I want you to understand is that what are we going to do with all these Chinese people once they finish building the railroad? And this is going to create a lot of problems, people, when we talk about immigration later on. We're going to discuss next is the Gilded Age, but what's going to happen? Where are these people going to go? I mean, it's not like a Mexican working on the railroad. You can just go back to Mexico. He's there in a day. No, these people have to be put back on a steamship and sent back to China, from the whatever area they came from. And a lot of them don't want to go back. A lot of them have, they remember that they are living in small communities named as Chinatown. If you ever have a chance to visit San Francisco or New York or any of those wonderful places, you need to be sure that you go to Chinatown because it's very rich. It's like they're not speaking English there. It's like you actually are in China. I've been fortunate to go to Chinatown in Boston, Chinatown in Philadelphia, Chinatown in New York, Chinatown in San Francisco. So these are communities that are very rich in there, and they look out for each other. Why do so many Chinese go into things like restaurants and laundry? It's because they were not allowed to do the jobs that educated white people could. It was prejudice. They would blame them for spreading tuberculosis because they felt that they would get tuberculosis because of the shape of their eyes. How do you make that connection? The shape of their eyes, they get tuberculosis. I read that in a book. They also give them a lot of crap for their opium dens. They out there working in the freaking railroad, 12, 14, 16-hour days. At the end of the day, you hit the opium pipe so you can forget everything and you're no longer riddled with pain. But a lot of people in the United States, especially women, begin to realize that, hey, I want to chase the dragon also. That's what they used to call it, to chase the dragon. So you would basically go to this den. It was like a place that had a bunch of little bunk beds with oriental rugs. Um, it was a very soothing place, and women would go in there, that were frustrated, or maybe they would go in there when they were menstruating to ease menstrual pains, and they would hit the opium pipe. And one of the things that I've read, okay, is that when you smoke opium, you tend to feel overheated. So the first thing you do is that you start stripping off your clothes, and of course you're, gallivanting, tripping out on, opium. And right away, people think, well, they're taking advantage of these women, and they're not. The Chinese are not going to do that. They don't want any problems. They're going to put you back into your bunk and make sure that your high passes, and then that's it. If you watch the movie, the one with Wyatt Earp, I forget what it's called, Tombstone. Tombstone. The guy accidentally shoots the sheriff after he smokes a opium pipe, and he thinks he's a werewolf, and he's tripping out. So opium was very popular in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. And then, of course, later on, they distill it and they put it in an elixir known as laudanum, and that becomes very addictive. Okay. It's like they used it as a cough syrup because it would deaden your, right? So then after that, then it goes into heroin, and then after heroin we have morphine. Every time they distill it again, is that they reformulate it so it won't be as addictive, right? Opium, heroin, uh, morphine, and then Demerol, right? And then we get rid of those, and you go into the codeines for painkillers, and then people get addicted to those. I'm not an expert in that, but I will say one thing. About a year and a half ago, I was passing a kidney stone, and I thought I was going to die. I actually thought I did die, but I didn't die because the pain was so bad. But I was told when I went into the hospital, they kind of laughed and they said, "Oh, you're passing a kidney stone." And the doctor that treated me was a female. And she said, "Hey, I want to tell you something." Once I didn't have pain, she told me, "I want you to know one thing, that I am a woman, and I have given birth, and I have passed a kidney stone. So I am telling you that the pain that you have experienced in passing that kidney stone is the pain that a woman experiences when she's giving birth." She said, "When I gave birth, I had a natural birth, and I passed a kidney stone without painkillers because I was out in the country. It was the same equivalent pain." And I'm like, "Oh, great." Now, why was I all mellowed out? Well, because as soon as she found out that I was passing a kidney stone, they hit me with a dose of, you got it, morphine. And when they hit me with that morphine, it was like, I don't care if you cut my head off or what you do to me. I feel great. I remember when they told me, where do you want me to put the IV? And it's like, I don't care. Just stab me wherever you want to. Stab me in the eye because I just want my midsection to stop hurting. And when they put the IV and then they hit me with that morphine, it was like nirvana. Anyway, sorry I went into that big rant, but that's why we have to be so careful. Now, the Chinese, for some reason or another, they don't get as addicted. Now, they do get addicted later on when the British get them addicted to it, but prior to that, they use it in moderation. It's really the people like the cowboys and stuff that say, "Oh, my back hurts because that bronc threw me out and I just want to get some sleep. I just want to have a really good time with a young lady. Let me hit this pipe a couple of times." And the Chinese get a bad rap for it. But the bottom line is that the Chinese they were only supplying the demand. You have a drug that has a demand, and the Chinese were smuggling it and bringing it in from China, and they were giving it to the American population. Now, that finishes our lecture for the West. When we come back, we're going to talk about the Gilded Age. Now, the common thread here is going to be the railroad. Okay, when we talk about the Gilded Age, we're going to talk about the railroad again. We're going to talk about the Chinese again when we talk about immigration. They were really ugly to the Chinese, okay? The United States of America has always had a ethnic scapegoat. It's always been very easy for Americans to point the finger at somebody. In the 1870s, it was the Chinese. Um, in the 1970s, it was the Vietnamese that were coming in from during Vietnam. In the 1980s, we had an influx of people from Bosnia. In the 1920s, in the 1910s and early 1920s, it was the Mexicans that were coming in during the Mexican Revolution, and again in the 1990s, that Mexicans that were fleeing the drug wars. It could be people from Guatemala, it could be people from Angola, it could be 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, and you have the Irish coming in during the potato famine. It could have been the Germans during the 1810s. I mean, there's always been somebody. During the 1870s and 1900s, it's Eastern Europeans, okay, and the Chinese, okay. In the West, it's Eastern Europeans. Eastern Europeans are not as desirable because they're darker skin. They come from Greece, they come from Poland, they come from Italy, they come from the Slavic countries, and they don't feel that those individuals are as pure as Germans or the French or the British, okay? So they're gonna tell them it's like you're inferior people and you're bringing all these horrible customs and you're Catholic and you worship saints and all this other. And in the South, of course, you're always gonna have a big trend of anti-Catholicism going on at this time. I mean, hey, Biden is only the second Catholic president that we have. Okay. The first one was John F. Kennedy. So now we have Biden. Okay. So you do see that trend there is that there always is going to be a scapegoat, but there's always going to be individuals that are nativists. You would think, well, the Irish are not going to be that way, and the Germans are not going to be that way, and the Italians are not going to be racist, and the Mexicans are not going to be racist because they know what it feels to be racist against. And no, we tend to forget. I always tell my students in my Mexican American history class is that Anglo Americans do not, under any circumstance, have a monopoly over racism. Okay, every culture is racist in its own way. Some cultures are even worse because they're racist and classist, and that's one thing that we see in a Mexican American culture. We're racist, and on top of that, they tell you can't go out with them, mijito, because they're not from your same class. They're más abajo. You don't go around with those people. I once had, my grandfather once told me that I couldn't go out with a certain girl because she was a migrant, but later on I was told by a girlfriend that her mom didn't want me going out with her because I was not from their social circle. So my grandfather encouraged me to discriminate against somebody, which I didn't. I still went out with that young lady. And that young lady that I was dating later on, her parents put an end to our relationship because I was not from the same class. Um, I am doing better than her husband that she's married to now. So, right? And I don't know what happened to the other young lady. I'm pretty sure she's doing well. But you have to see those things. And this can also be construed as xenophobia, that we are afraid of the other people. We're afraid of another culture. We're afraid of the God they pray to. We're leery of the way they dress. We're leery of the way they worship. We're leery of what they eat. Oh, those Mexicans, y'all eat guts and stuff like that. And it's like, I had a friend of mine that was from Scotland that was telling me that it was so gross that I ate menudo, but he was telling me how great haggis was. And Americans love hot dogs. I mean, ugh, I mean, how more basic can you get? It's like, so we're going to talk about these things when we talk about immigration, and they're going to be incredibly important. But, I didn't mean to go off again into a tangent and add another 15 minutes into this lecture, but When I get there, then I'll know that I've talked about it. When I come back, I'm going to talk about the Gilded Age and robber barons and see if we're still there. And then we're going to go Gilded Age straight into immigration and foreign people living in America, which are mostly going to be Eastern, okay, and reasons for immigration and why immigration is always so popular and why it's always so popular to come to the United States. Why? Because most people that come to the United States are fleeing religious turmoil, famine, or they want a better opportunity. So I will talk to you all later. Be kind to each other. I hope that you listen to this really long lecture. Uh, and wear your mask. I was very proud to say that I went to a gun show in Dallas today, and most people were playing fair and wearing their masks. So, anyway, be kind to each other. If you live at home, tell your parents how much you love them, and wear your mask. Take it easy. Goodbye, and thank you for watching. Also, subscribe to my channel, and if you like my mini lecture, tell me that you like it, and tell me if you find things wrong with it, that you found things wrong with it. I won't take it personal. Thank you. Bye bye.